That card doesn't mean anything anymore. You're not in the system, old man. The words hit like a slap. Loud, dismissive, final. They came from the mouth of a young woman in her 20s, glossy name badge clipped to her pristine blazer, who didn't even bother to look up as she flicked the veteran ID card back across the desk like it was a used napkin. It slid toward him, stopping just short of the edge, face down. Rejected. The man standing across the counter didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't even blink. He just stood there, tall despite the stoop in his back, shoulders still squared by old instinct. His name was Miles Everett, age 81. A retired First Sergeant in the U.S. Army, Signal Corps. But today, he was being told that didn't matter. He had come to the Federal Veterans Benefits Office in Atlanta, the same building that bore an engraving over its entrance: honor, integrity, and service. And yet here he was, treated like he was a fraud, like he didn't belong. Miles had woken up early that morning. He had laid out his clothes the night before: creased slacks, his cleanest button-down shirt, and the thin windbreaker with the faded patch on the sleeve. U.S. Army, retired. His polished shoes didn't match his outfit, but they were all he had left from his dress uniform, a silent protest against being invisible. His granddaughter, Naomi, had offered to take the day off to go with him, but he said no. "I fought wars. I think I can handle paperwork." He'd said it with a chuckle, but behind his eyes, Naomi had seen the weight. He needed this. Not just the benefits, the recognition, the validation, the simple truth that his service, his name, still meant something. At 9:15 a.m., he stepped into the building with his cane, his ID, and a folder full of discharge documents. He had waited nearly 2 hours, watched others go before him. He didn't complain, didn't cause a fuss. Finally, his number was called. Desk 7. The woman behind it never looked up, never asked how he was, just motioned for his documents. 5 minutes later, she uttered that sentence. "That card doesn't mean anything anymore. You're not in the system, old man." She said it with the kind of ease that only comes from routine, as if she had said it before, many times. Miles's hand trembled slightly as he turned over the ID, looking at it as if for the first time. The corners were frayed, the photo faded, but it was his. Issued in 1981, after 27 years of service, 3 deployments, and countless acts that never made it into any ceremony or citation. "It's expired," she added, flatly, coldly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and asked quietly, "Do you know what this card meant to me when they gave it to me?" She didn't answer. She just tapped her keyboard, then rolled her eyes. "I can't help you. You'll have to reapply online." Her voice carried all the indifference of someone who never had to fight for anything beyond a Wi-Fi signal. Miles nodded, once, then gathered his documents slowly, his hands careful, precise, the way soldiers did things when they knew the world had stopped caring. He turned to leave. No scene, no anger, just that quiet ache in his chest. Outside, the sun was warm, but Miles felt cold. He sat on a bench across from the building, watching other veterans come and go, some young, some old, some with family, others alone like him. He looked down at his hands, felt the tremor. Age, maybe, or maybe just disappointment settling deep in the bones. After a while, he reached into his folder, pulled out a copy of his DD-214, his official discharge document, still folded sharp, despite the years. Behind it was a photo, black and white. 5 men in fatigues, radio antenna in the background, sandbags, tension in their eyes. He stared at the man in the center, younger, stronger, eyes wide with purpose. Him, Miles Everett, 1968, Da Nang. He traced the edge of the photo with a calloused finger. Then something shifted. "Excuse me, sir," a voice. Gentle, young. Miles looked up. A young man in uniform stood before him. Army fatigues, fresh boots, that unmistakable posture. His name tag read Morales. I saw what happened inside. I was in line. That wasn't right." Miles nodded slowly. Didn't speak, didn't need to. Morales looked nervous, then determined. "I don't mean to be forward, but you said your name's Miles Everett, right?" Miles nodded again. Morales took out his phone, typed something, then blinked. You're First Sergeant Everett? You're the one from the Long-Reach Commanderline incident?" Miles tilted his head. "That was a long time ago, son." "My father told me that story, said if it weren't for the team who held that line, half the convoy would have been wiped out." Miles shrugged. "I just kept the radios working." "That was you?" Miles didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Morales stepped back and saluted. Miles froze, then slowly rose to his feet and returned the salute, crisp, clean, like muscle memory, like respect resurrected. That night, Morales posted the story on social media. Just a short caption, a photo of the ID, and one sentence. "They told him this doesn't mean anything anymore. I disagree." Within 24 hours, the post had over 1.2 million views. Veterans across the country started posting pictures of their own old IDs, of their fathers, their grandfathers. News outlets picked it up. Military forums exploded. Podcasts wanted interviews. And somewhere in Atlanta, a clerk at Desk 7 was called into a closed-door meeting. But Miles Everett didn't know any of that yet. He sat in his living room the next day, the same quiet smile on his face, sipping black coffee as the sun spilled in. A knock at the door. When he opened it, there were 3 men in uniform, one with silver oak leaves, the others in civilian suits, but with eyes that carried the weight of command. The man in front saluted. "First Sergeant Everett, may we come in?" Miles blinked, stepped aside. For the first time in decades, someone had come not to deny him something, but to listen. It was the knock that didn't belong. Not the lazy thump of a neighbor, not the quick official raps of a delivery. This was sharp, deliberate, 3 knocks evenly spaced, like discipline wrapped in wood. Miles opened the door. 3 men in crisp suits stood on his porch. They didn't wear badges, but they carried something heavier: presence. One of them, an older black man with silver-rimmed glasses and a posture that hadn't bent in 60 years, stepped forward. "Miles Bennett?" "Yes." "I'm Lieutenant General Howard Keene, United States Army, retired. May we speak with you?" For a moment, Miles forgot how to breathe. The same army that once tore up his paperwork, now at his door. He let them in. The living room still smelled faintly of tobacco and old varnish. He offered them water. They declined. General Keene sat forward. "We saw the footage. What happened to you at that office, it's unacceptable. But more importantly, it never should have happened at all." The second man, younger, white, clearly former intelligence, opened a thin folder and slid a document across the coffee table. "You were awarded a Bronze Star for actions during Operation Skybreaker, 1969. That commendation should have made you eligible for full veteran benefits." Miles stared at the document like it was a ghost. He whispered, "They told me the paperwork was incomplete, lost in the shuffle." "It wasn't lost. It was erased." Silence. Not just in the room, but in Miles' bones. He had suspected it, felt it, the way his unit scattered after the war, the way his letters went unanswered, the way every request he submitted seemed to vanish into bureaucratic quicksand. Erased. "Was it because I was black?" he asked finally. General Keane didn't answer at first. He leaned back, took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose like he was carrying the weight of every forgotten soldier with him. "Yes." Just one word, but it fell like a hammer through years of silence. "We've uncovered patterns, names removed, records redirected, units redeployed without notice. Your name is on a list, not of dishonor, but of buried service." The man in intelligence added, "We're assembling a task force. We want your help, not just as a case study, but as a voice." Miles' eyes drifted toward the worn box in the corner, the one with his old medals, his boots, his tattered patches. "What if I'm not ready to be a voice?" he said. General Keane stood, his hand resting briefly on Miles' shoulder. "You already are. You just haven't been heard yet." They left as quietly as they came. That night Miles sat in the dark. The house around him had grown quiet over the years, too quiet. The kind of silence that forgets, that numbs, that buries. But something was different now. He opened the old box. Inside, beneath the folded flag from his father's funeral and the moldy envelope that once carried in military ID no one honored, was a photograph. It was his unit. 6 men, 2 black, 4 white, all mud-soaked and half-smiling in front of a chopper that looked like it had survived just one mission too many. On the back, faded ink, "Skybreaker, 1969. We made it. Barely. L.T. Daniels." He traced the handwriting with his finger. He didn't need a podium, didn't want revenge, but he wanted the truth to breathe again. For the first time in decades, Miles picked up the phone, not to argue, not to beg. He called a name from the past, one he had found in a newsletter 3 years ago, a man named Darren Krause, former medic, still alive. The voice on the other end cracked when Miles said, "It's me." By morning, they had a plan, not for vengeance, but for resurrection. Darren Krause hadn't heard Miles Everett's voice in over 40 years, but the moment it came through the phone, low, steady, unmistakable, it brought back everything. The mud, the blood, the day they both almost died under a collapsed signal tower, screaming into broken radios for help that never came. Now, all that weight had a reason and a name: erasure. "Damn, Miles," Darren said, his voice thick. "I thought you were long gone." "I was, just not the way they hoped." By the next week, they met in person, 2 old soldiers at a worn VFW hall in Alabama. The place still smelled like cheap beer and sawdust. But when Miles opened his folder and laid out the documents, old orders, patrol reports, even the yellowed copy of his commendation recommendation, something shifted. Darren took a long look and said, "I was the medic that wrote this witness statement, and they told me it was lost in transport. I should have known." They weren't alone for long. Word had spread. Veterans from the old Skybreaker unit started showing up. Then men from other units. Men who had also been told that car doesn't mean anything anymore. And women too. Black nurses, communication specialists, and supply officers who had been told their roles weren't critical when they tried to apply for benefits. Each of them brought a folder. Each folder had missing pages. Each page had a name, a moment, a memory buried in someone else's silence. Within 2 weeks, they were 70 strong. Then came the press. A local reporter, Marissa Del Toro, caught wind of the gathering after her uncle, a veteran himself, shared a photo on Facebook. She arrived with a notepad and a cameraman, expecting a few old men swapping war stories. What she found instead was a wall of silence. Not because no one wanted to speak, but because the weight of what they had carried for decades took time to find words again. Miles finally stepped up. His voice wasn't booming, but it was steady, grounded. He told the story of the Skybreaker line, how their signal team stayed behind during a retreat to keep radio communications open, how they were shelled, how 2 of his men died in his arms, how he was recommended for a Bronze Star, and then told, "Your name wasn't selected, no reason given." He held up the card that had started it all, worn, cracked, faded. "They said this doesn't mean anything anymore, but let me tell you something. This card, this ID, was the only thing that made me feel like I still had a name, that I wasn't just a number, that I hadn't been forgotten." Del Toro filmed the whole thing. She posted a 2-minute segment that night, unsure if it would make a dent in the noise of the world. By morning, the video had 3 million views. Soon, it wasn't just about Miles, it was about everyone. A movement began, called Operation Remembered, with Miles' old ID as its symbol. Not polished, not perfect, but real. Veterans sent in photos of torn-up badges, dog tags found in drawers, faded photos, and medals never worn. One image went viral, a hand holding a veteran ID over a trash can with the caption, "They told me it didn't matter. I believe it does. Hashtag still means something." Across the country, people began asking, how many were left off the lists? How many were denied honor quietly? Miles didn't want a spotlight, but the truth had already found its voice. He started speaking at community halls, VA centers, even high schools. Each time he ended the same way. "My name is Miles Everett. I served. I never asked to be remembered, but I won't be erased." The White House press secretary shifted in her seat. Behind the podium, the air in the briefing room thickened with tension. Reporters waved their hands, voices overlapping, and every second question had the same name, Miles Everett. What is the administration's response to the Operation Remembered movement? Is it true there are thousands of unreconciled veteran records? Will President Harlan be issuing a formal apology to Mr. Everett and others like him? For 3 days straight, the government had tried to stay silent, hoping the wave would pass. But this was no wave, it was a flood. And the image of Miles, standing in front of the National Archives, holding his torn veteran ID with the words "Still Means Something" painted on cardboard, had become a national symbol. That morning, the New York Times ran the headline, "The ID they told him to forget, now framed in every veteran's heart." Back in Alabama, Miles sat in his living room wearing his old Army jacket. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Senators, journalists, activists, even a few generals, some retired, some active duty, called in private to say, "We knew, we're sorry, and we're with you now." But none of it made him feel better. Not yet. Because the truth wasn't a headline to Miles. It was faces, voices. It was Maurice, his radio tech, 19 years old when the mortar struck. It was Leona Fields, the nurse from Detroit who patched him up when he couldn't walk. It was Alvin Dean, the one who taught him to play cards and never made it out of Laos. They were the real reason Miles kept speaking, not for revenge, but remembrance. That afternoon, Marissa Del Toro returned to his home. She brought a letter, sealed with the presidential emblem. "You've been invited to the Capitol," she said. "They want to give you the medal in person, in front of the cameras." Miles didn't even look at the envelope. "They want a ceremony?" he asked. "They want the story to end with a bow," she replied. He nodded, then said, "It doesn't end there." 2 weeks later, Miles walked into a congressional hearing room not to receive a medal, but to testify. The room was packed. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder in the back, some in full uniform, some in T-shirts that read, "Not lost, but buried." Miles stepped to the microphone. He took his time. Then, with a voice firm as steel, he said, "I don't need another medal. I need the record to reflect the truth. that we served, that we bled, that we mattered, and that no man's name should be filed into silence because of the color of his skin. Silence filled the chamber. Even the congressman who had previously dismissed the hearings as political theater sat frozen. Miles reached into his pocket and pulled out the old ID. It was torn, bent, faded. He placed it on the desk like evidence. "I was told this meant nothing," he said, "but it meant everything, because it meant I was seen." The crowd stood, not with cheers, but with reverence, a silence of respect, a silence that had waited 50 years.
1 year later, the sunlight over Arlington National Cemetery cut through the early spring mist like memory through time. A new section had been added near the tomb of the unknown soldier. Small, solemn, bordered with stone benches and a bronze plaque that read, "To the forgotten ranks, whose service was real even when their records were not." In the center stood a glass case. Inside, one torn military ID. Worn, cracked, and still legible. Name, Miles Everett. Service, U.S. Army Signal Corps. Status, honored. Finally. Nearby, a group of high school students gathered around an elderly black woman. She was reading from a printed pamphlet titled "The ID They Told Him to Forget." Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she reached the final quote. "You don't need rank to matter. You need truth. And the truth is, every name we buried in silence is a name we must now speak aloud." One of the students raised his hand. "Is Mr. Everett still alive?" She smiled. "He's very much alive, but he doesn't come here often." Miles Everett didn't need to come, because the legacy had already moved beyond him. Operation Remembered had become more than a hashtag. It was now a national registry, cataloging more than 4,300 cases of undocumented or erased military service records, particularly from veterans of color and immigrant backgrounds. Each story submitted was reviewed, verified, and, when possible, corrected. Families received medals, graves received markers, silence received sound. And it had all started with one man and one torn piece of plastic. At his modest Alabama home, Miles sat on the porch with Darren beside him. They were watching two neighborhood kids run drills across the lawn, pretending they were signal corpsmen setting up field comms. One of them had a cardboard ID on a shoelace around his neck. Miles laughed. "That one's already better than I ever was." Darren grinned. "You weren't so bad. You just never got your ceremony." Miles shook his head. "I didn't need one. I just needed to know it mattered." From inside the house, a voice called out. Marissa Del Toro, now a Pulitzer-winning journalist and still part of their family by choice. "You've got another box from D.C., she shouted. "This one says presidential citation attached." Miles didn't get up. He just looked out across the lawn and said quietly, "They keep sending paper, but I already got what I came for." "What's that?" Darren asked. He pointed toward the kids, toward the porch swing with the folded flag, the news clippings, the stack of handwritten letters from veterans across the country. "Truth. That's all I ever wanted to survive me." That night, as the stars settled over the quiet southern town, a single porch light stayed on. Not because someone had forgotten to turn it off, but because sometimes, when a man's story is finally seen, he leaves a light on for the others still waiting to be remembered.